With the world careening toward the precipice of nuclear war, with rampant crime and inflation, with our inner cities being reduced to dystopian hellscapes of misery and suffering and human despair, it can be difficult at times to focus, as often as we know we should, on the things that are beautiful and edifying, and in this case, uplifting. And who better to deliver that reminder than a woman who became a celebrity by being the daughter of O.J. Simpson's lawyer, who made a sex tape with a rapper. But that's just where we are now, ladies and gentlemen. Either learn to love it or increase your alcohol intake. The point being, Ms. Kardashian, I don't know whether she's currently married or who her husband might be, so I'm just going to call her Ms. Kardashian, has reemerged from that foggy, misty Avalon where vapid idiot celebrities go when they're taking a break from being vapid idiot celebrities to deliver her contribution to lasting world peace and positive cooperation between the peoples of all nations. Ladies and gentlemen, but mostly ladies, I present for your consideration the Skims Ultimate Nipple Bra. Now, if you're one of those women who often finds yourself thinking, I'd really like to go to work with my nipples poking out today so all my co-workers can know I have absolutely no sense of social propriety or professional decorum, but I'm not quite as young as I used to be, and my tits hang so low these days, it's just not a very realistic option. It's important that you understand two things. One, you are not alone, and two, Kim Kardashian has heard your plaintive cries for help, and like all of history's great thinkers, she didn't sit around complaining about the problem. She went and she invented a damn solution. Why? Because climate change. Quote! The Earth's temperature is getting hotter and hotter. The sea levels are rising, the ice sheets are shrinking, and I'm no scientist, but I do believe everyone can use their skill set to do their part. End quote, said the inimitable Ms. Kardashian. Quote again, that's why I'm introducing a brand new bra with a built-in nipple, so no matter how hot it is, you'll always look cold. Some days are hard, but these nipples are harder, and unlike the icebergs, these aren't going anywhere, end quote. But wait, I hear you say, isn't not having your nipples poking out one of the reasons for wearing a brassiere in the first place? Well, frankly, yes, that's always been my understanding. And besides, if you wanted to wear a bra and still have your headlights turned on high beam, couldn't you just cut a couple of nipple-sized holes in your bra cups and boom, problem solved? Well, that's not for this reporter to say. The point is, if we can't all come together and celebrate something as good and noble as praiseworthy as the ultimate nipple bra, then maybe we really are doomed. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where Jim Eagle and I both agree that was one of our most titillating opening segments ever. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. And if you're like most people, if I asked you the question, what was the first U.S. warship sunk by hostile action in the Second World War? You'd probably say something along the lines of, come on, too easy. USS Arizona, Pearl Harbor, ask me something hard, why don't you? But hold on just a second there, Captain Self-Congratulation, because that is not the correct answer. The USS Reuben James DD-245 was a Clemson-class destroyer laid down April 1919, entered service September 1920. She displaced 1,234 tons with a length, beam, and draft of 315 feet, 31 feet, and 9 feet, respectively. She carried two geared steam turbine engines, good for 26,500 horsepower and a top speed of 40 knots, with a range of 4,900 nautical miles. She was armed with four 4-inch guns, one 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, and 12 torpedo tubes of 21 inches diameter. Her ship's complement was 7 officers, 150 men, and exactly 82 years ago today, Friday, 31 October 1941, all 7 officers and 93 of those men went to the bottom of the Atlantic along with their ship when, courtesy of a torpedo attack by the German U-boat U-552, Reuben James became the first U.S. warship lost to hostile action in the Second World War. But wait, I hear you say, Weren't we not at war with anybody in October of 41? Correct, we were not, but more on all that in just a moment. First, we need to talk about the fact that USS Reuben James and the two subsequent USS Reuben Jameses, the most recent of which was only just decommissioned around 5 years ago, were named in honor of a guy who probably didn't exist. But for that story, we have to go all the way back to the First Barbary War in 1836, in which Lieutenant Stephen Decatur became a celebrated national hero for repulsing a boarding action upon his ship by Barbary pirates during the siege of Tripoli. Part of the story, as it was reported back in the United States, was that during the heat of the battle, in the midst of the hand-to-hand fighting on the quarterdeck, one of the pirates attempted to strike Stephen Decatur with his saber, but a brave young sailor named Reuben James stepped in and took the blow himself, saving the life of his commander and being grievously injured himself for his trouble. And it's worth noting here that there was an almost identical legend about Horatio Nelson, which would have been well known to everyone in naval circles in 1836, and the U.S. doesn't have much of a naval combat tradition yet at this stage, so it's almost as if some overzealous newspaper writer, in his zeal to help his country establish a naval mythology just as good as Britain's, simply engrafted the previously existing Nelson legend onto Captain Decatur and invented the name of the hero protagonist pretty much out of whole cloth. But clearly it had the desired effect, for indeed the story of brave Reuben James did wind up imprinting itself in the American cultural memory, and it was only many decades later, well after the turn of the 20th century, that it started occurring to any historians that maybe they ought to double-check the veracity of the legend and verify that there really was a Reuben James, and that he really performed the act he is reputed to have performed. I mean, it would be pretty embarrassing if the whole thing was made up, especially since we've just launched a destroyer named USS Reuben James. I mean, if we're naming ships after fictional characters, I myself would like to be the commander of USS Bugs Bunny, is all I'm saying. But yeah, sometimes the legend just doesn't live up to the legend. So after a bit of basic scrutiny, it was quickly established that not only is there no record of a sailor named Reuben James being treated by the surgeon after the battle, and remember, he's supposed to have suffered a grievous head wound from an enemy saber, but there's no record of a sailor named Reuben James serving in the First Barbary War, or serving anywhere else for that matter, in the whole 60-year history of the U.S. Navy up to that point. But wait, I hear you say. If they figured out in the 1920s that there was no Reuben James, why did they repeat the mistake and give that same name to two more ships? Well, it's a good question, dear viewer, and here's the answer. Because the second two ships aren't named for Reuben James, the fictional hero sailor. They are named in honor of the ship USS Reuben James and her officers and crew who were lost on 31 October 1941. But back to that other little trifling detail, namely the fact that we weren't at war with Germany, so why the hell is Germany sinking our damn ships? And the answer to that question is more complicated than you might think. Now, how was it that USS Reuben James and U-552 wound up in the same neighborhood on the same day, and why did they engage in hostilities despite their countries not being at war? Well, Reuben James was on convoy escort duties with convoy HX-158 bound from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Liverpool. So clearly you've got a British convoy here. It's traveling from a British Dominion to the British Isles, and it can fully expect to be attacked by U-boats during its eastward transit. So why is it being escorted by U.S. warships? Isn't that a fairly serious breach of our own policies of neutrality? Why, yes. Yes, it is. So that's why nobody outside of the War Department, the Navy Department, and the White House had any idea it was going on. Which made for an interesting bit of PR spin after the sinking of Reuben James, because it was never told to the public that she was sunk in the act of escorting a British convoy. The version of events the public heard was that our ship was just innocently minding its own business in international waters, and some bastard Germans in a U-boat surprise attacked them and killed our boys just because they're a bunch of evil Nazi vermin. Which is to say, for a president and an administration who were very desirous of dropping the pretense of neutrality and getting on with the fighting of the war, they didn't mind it all that much if a false story got reported that softened the isolationist mood a bit. It created a desire for vengeance on the part of Mr. and Mrs. America, which one could argue might have been a big part of the reason why we had our ships escorting British convoys, secretly escorting them, mind you, and practically daring the U-boats to fire torpedoes at us. Now, the U.S. ships and the German wolf packs were both operating under very strict rules of engagement. The American ships were not to engage in any sort of direct hostilities with any German adversary, and the U-boat captains had been enjoined not to fire under any circumstances at any vessel flying the U.S. flag, which, incidentally, Reuben James was not doing on the day in question, but more on that later. Now, technically, in order to make the thing appear at least passingly legal under international law, the U.S. vessels in the convoy escort were observers, wink wink, and not combatants, and there were always Royal Navy vessels in the lead and ostensibly in command of the whole shooting match, and it was they who would engage in any direct hostilities that might or might not need to be engaged in. But the U.S. ships still came in extremely handy because the Germans aren't allowed to shoot at them. So you just put a screen of U.S. destroyers around the convoy ships that you're protecting, and they're effectively insulated, cocooned even almost, from any potential torpedo attack. And by the fall of 41, this system is working out pretty well. The period the German U-boat captains called the first happy time came to an end. Sinkings of convoy ships declined rather dramatically, and on board the U.S. destroyers, the captains started wondering aloud amongst themselves exactly what the definition of direct hostilities is. I mean, look, we understand we're not allowed to fire any guns or torpedoes at the Germans, but what about depth charges? I mean, if I drop a depth charge, I'm not directly attacking an enemy vessel because I have no idea where he is. I'm just dropping an explosive device into an area at a depth where I think he might potentially be located, and if he happens to blunder into the area where my depth charge happens to be exploding, well, that's his fault, not mine. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the top Navy brass and the president were all too happy to sign on to that memo. And so, before long, it becomes standard operating procedure that when we know there's an enemy wolf pack in the area, every vessel in the escort, British and American alike, they drop a freaking hailstorm of depth charges on those sons of bitches. Now, over on the other side, this behavior is seen as pretty darned ungentlemanly by the German U-boat captains, including the commander of the aforementioned U-552, Kapitan Lieutenant Erich Top, who's a unique figure for a few different reasons. First, because he was really outstanding at his job. By the end of the war, he was one of the top submarine aces in the whole Kriegsmarine. Dude sent 35 ships to the bottom for a total of 197,460 gross registered tons sunk. And those numbers are nothing to sneeze at. But even more improbably than that, this dude was a highly successful U-boat captain who actually survived the war and lived all the way until frickin' 1992, which makes him pretty close to unique in his profession, because nearly all of those U-boat guys got killed in the war. Oh, you know what else made him unique? He was an ardent, unabashed, very enthusiastic National Socialist, joined the party all the way back in 1934. He was a card-carrying Nazi nearly as long as he was a naval officer, and that made him very much the outlier in the Kriegsmarine. The Navy was never a hotbed of National Socialist true believers, even less than the Army was. So a guy who went around flashing his 1934 party card and talking about how much he sparkly hearts Mein Kampf probably would have stood out like something pretty close to a sore thumb. Oh, also, Erich Top, the proudly inveterate Nazi sinker of the Reuben James, he went on to become a rear admiral in the West German Navy and one of the top uniformed officials in NATO. And I'll just leave that right there. Meanwhile, back in October of 41, Kapitan Lieutenant Erich Top and his fellow U-boat commanders are getting pretty impatient with this feigned neutrality on the part of the Americans, which they are feigning less and less convincingly. But hey, sometimes you gotta drop a depth charge on a guy just to let him know how very neutral you are. These things happen. But the Germans, perhaps by design, perhaps not, they started getting them some itchy trigger fingers, and along with that came a detailed attention to any possible loopholes they might be able to find in their rules of engagement. Especially that little part that can be read, if one chooses to read it that way, as perhaps implicit authorization to fire on an American ship if she isn't flying the U.S. colors. So Reuben James is skirting the perimeter of the convoy, dropping depth charges, not really so much to damage or sink the enemy U-boats, but more forcing them to keep a sufficient distance that they can't close for a makeable torpedo shot on the convoy ships. And they won't shoot at us, the destroyers, because they're not allowed to shoot at us. But interestingly, crucially, Reuben James on this day is not currently flying the Stars and Stripes from her mast. It's impossible to say from a remove of 82 years whether this was an intentional oversight born in the Oval Office or a silly blunder by an anonymous petty officer, but in any event, Capitan Lieutenant Tope, he noticed. Oh, but wait, did he shoot that torpedo at Reuben James, or did he shoot it at the convoy ship that Reuben James was screening, and she just happened to go into its path and got her bow blown off and her magazine exploded? Now, just as with the matter of Reuben James's mast being absent of colors, it's impossible to say one way or the other. And you can imagine what the reaction looked like on Main Street America when everybody got the news that this evil, marauding, piratical bastard of a U-boat captain has sunk our innocent destroyer without warning or provocation when we were just trying to enjoy our neutrality, having a pleasant Friday afternoon cruise. But when you consider the story of the sinking of the Reuben James, it really adds context to how shocking it was when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor a mere 5 weeks later, because nobody in the U.S. was expecting to find themselves suddenly at war with Japan. It was widely expected that Japan was going to try and cut some sort of a deal to keep their conquests in China and the Pacific, and they were focused on avoiding war with America. Germany, they're out there sinking our destroyers without cause. Clearly, those assholes want to fight. So it's just a matter of when we go and fight those dirty Hun bastards. And then, boom, the last thing anybody expects to happen happens. A mode of attack that was thought logistically impossible by a country we didn't think was going to attack us anyway. And then Hitler declares war on us the next day, which a lot of people are still confused by, but I don't see anything confusing about it. He obviously had decided he was going to fight everybody by that point, including us. He had obviously greenlit the sinking of our destroyer. How do I know that? Because Erich Tope received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with swords and diamonds and got himself a big fat old promotion. And Adolf Hitler wasn't in the habit of lavishing his regime's third highest award for valor on guys who sink ships by accident, is all I'm saying. If it was an accident, they probably would have given him the same choice they gave to Rommel. Either kill yourself with cyanide, or we'll torture your wife and kids to death in front of you and then shoot you in the head. We await your decision in 90 seconds. Thanks, and have a Sieg Heil Day! And no, that last part is not the outgoing message on Justin Trudeau's answering machine. That is a scurrilous right-wing conspiracy theory. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Have a great day and a pleasant tomorrow. Hope everybody had a delightful Halloween. Lady viewers, if you wore something slutty, the host is accepting photo evidence, by the way. See you next time. Do not comply. Get off my lawn!